Thank you. Thank you. In my country, we would traditionally begin any conference like this or speaking with acknowledgement of country, which is to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous elders, and I would do the same here and acknowledge the Indigenous people of this nation and acknowledge we meet on Indigenous land. Your conference is ourselves, our values and our actions, and I'm hoping that I might be able to shed some light on what's happening in Australia, and hopefully you may get some information from it that then certainly can inform your conference. These kind of conferences, of course, where we share ideas and values, are particularly important as we fight the global neoliberal agenda that would see public education destroyed. We've seen in Australia the re-election of a Conservative government on July the 2nd of this year, which has got no commitment to public education and indeed no commitment really to the public sphere. And now we are fighting a race to keep any of the gains that we have made that would see our disadvantaged schools go further behind. But we've got some advantages. We've got very strong community support after years of campaigning, and we've punished the government. They've limped back into power. Well, not really power, that's wrong. They've limped back into office, that not necessarily have power. They've got a one-seat majority, and we'll do our best to make sure that that is whittled away even further. And we'll continue the fight. So this is the background. Where does Australia fit in terms of education? We are a low equity nation in terms of resourcing. We've got the largest disparity in resources available between low and high socioeconomic schools across the OECD. We've got a massive gap, a huge gap. And it's increasing each and every year. We have had a funding system that has given money to successful advantaged children over those who need it. The difference between low and high SES schools in Australia is the 5th largest in the OECD, and the difference in quality of physical infrastructure is among the highest in the OECD. What that information does not tell you is the levels of concentration of disadvantage. Because when you concentrate disadvantage in the one school, then the complexity of need increases exponentially. Almost every one of those low SES schools, and I'm talking something like 99.5%, nearly every single one of them is in the public system. And 60% of most disadvantaged students are enrolled in these schools. And this is the level of concentration that's substantially higher than any comparable OECD country. So when you look at Australia against the OECD countries, the red bar graph is Australia, the green is the OECD average. So the disparity in resources between low and high SES schools in Australia, as I said, it's the 5th highest. And so there's Australia, there's the OECD average, and if we were to draw a line across, you can see there's only 4 other countries, including your own, that has that disparity in resources between low and high SES schools. Both our nations have been favouring advantaged children. And to me, that's a moral question. It's an ethical question. You talk about our values. Well, I know what my value is, and to give precedence to people with already life-affirming advantage, and then to say to children who don't have that advantage, we will never, ever support you as a government in your schools, is untenable. So when you look at the Australian system, we've got the non-government and the government system, Our union of 187,000 teachers, we cover the public sector. And if you look at where, this is just a sample from that came out of the Gonski review, which I'll come to in a moment, of where the levels of disadvantage are, you'll see the blue bar graph is the public system, the reddish is the Catholic system, and the green is the other independent schools. So if you look at it from in terms of low SES, Indigenous, remote, very remote, disability, and we're talking about refugee students or students from a non-English speaking background. It's the public system that's been doing the heavy lifting for years, but without the resources. And the Catholic and the other private schools have now become schools of social mobility. And indeed, if you were to look at the Catholic system, the last 10 years, the only enrolment increase they've had is from non-Catholics, and non-Catholics with wealth. 69% of poor Catholics are in the public school system. Trevor Cobbold is an activist in Australia, works out of Canberra, and is an economist. And it's a pretty telling statement. 6 times more likely to be a low performer than an advantaged student. So we came up with, after years of campaigning, the notion of Gonski. David Gonski was a businessman, or is a businessman, head of Coca-Cola, Sydney Stock Exchange, on the board of very elite, exclusive Sydney Grammar. And he was appointed to chair a panel a few years ago by the Gillard-Rudd government and came up with a review. After 7,000 submissions and academic research, the Gonski review, if I could explain it very, very quickly to you. And we're calling it Gonski. Thank God his name wasn't David Smith, or that would have no pickup at all. But the Gonski review came up with this notion. They looked at 1,600 Australian schools that had 80% of their cohort getting at or above national standards in literacy and numeracy. Then they looked at the resources, and you know what they found? They found a direct correlation between highly resourced schools and high success in student outcomes. Now, for a teacher, that's a no-brainer. But 7,000 submissions, academic research, 2 or 3 years of research, they've come up with what we know intuitively, high resourcing, higher outcomes. So that became a resource standard. And then they said we will need state and federal governments, with a federal system in Australia, state and federal governments to kick in money for 6 years to drag every school up to that resource standard. And they backloaded the money, unfortunately. 6 years of transition funding from 2014 to 2019, and after 2019, state and federal governments were to maintain funding in perpetuity so that no school would ever drop below that resource standard. That's the Gonski model in a nutshell. And the Tories, our coalition parties, have hated it ever since the day it was published. It offends their notion of advantaging the advantage, and that's where the campaign is placed. So we have now we're in year 3 of Gonski. Money is flowing into those sign-up states, and we are seeing a significant difference. But I want to just tell you where we came from. Because I know there'll be conservative politicians. I could almost bet my house, which is mainly mortgaged, so it's not much of a bet, on it. But there'll be conservative politicians in this country who would say money doesn't matter. It's not about resources. It's about the quality of the teacher. Mind you, we never talk about the quality of nurses, do we? Or quality of doctors. We talk about the quality of healthcare, but somehow the teaching profession, we talk about the quality of teachers as though we are responsible for poverty and disadvantage. And our politicians have been saying there's been a massive, we have funded schools more this year than any other previous year. That's because there's more kids in the system, you dope. But let's look at the real figures. Between 2000 and 2013, just before Gonski came in 2014, the total increase was not 40% as the Conservatives put out, was less than 7%. But when we look at when we take out of increases in gas, water, electricity and teachers' salaries, the net increase was less than 1%. And most of that less than 1% went to the non-government sector. The Australian economy grew in the same period by 1.48%. We became wealthier as a nation, but our schools got less money. And Ken Boston, who was on the panel, summarised it so well. This, to me, should be a quote that we write down and we throw at every politician. The teachers in our most disadvantaged schools are at least as good as those in our most advantaged schools. The issue is not their competence, skill or commitment. The issue is that their number, resources and support are unequal to the task. We wouldn't throw doctors and nurses into a hospital without giving them the resources they need to make a patient better. But we do it to teachers every day. We give them an impossible task and say, fix it. And we need to, as a profession, say, no, we'll fix it. Yes, we'll do our best, but give us the resources and we will fix some of society's most pressing problems. In terms of Indigenous education, Gonski was incredibly important for Indigenous students across my nation. The achievement gap is shameful. And no citizen of Australia can be proud of the fact that the achievement gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students is, on average, 5 years. And the retention rates is so much lower. There's so many figures we could quote, and they're just a couple of the headline figures. Gonski exponentially increased funding to schools with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' enrolments. Students with disability. We have an estimation of 270,000 students with disability, and about half of them have not one single dollar given to their schools in the public system to support them. Not a dollar. And there are physical and intellectual disabilities. 87% of our principals surveyed in January and February this year say they do not have the funds to deal with disability in the classroom. I don't know how a politician can say to a parent with a child with disability, your child's chances, because of that disability, will never be able to be dealt with. There'll be never support. The nation can't afford it. We've got a budget crisis. We can build in Australia 12 submarines, costing many billions of dollars, $55 billion, but we can't fund schools. So this is where we're up to with the Gonski funding model. There's the 6 years of transition funding. Remember, after 2019, it's meant to be maintained in perpetuity, recurrent funding. 2016, if that 6 years was a 100-kilometre journey, we're only 18 kilometres down the road, and the federal government is saying by 2017 we're scratching it. It's going. So that's what we're going to lose. The bulk of the money will go. And indeed, what will happen is a new funding model will be developed, and that funding model will see 62% of federal money going to the non-government sector, to schools like King's at Parramatta, Sydney, or Sydney Grammar. King's has over 11 cricket pitches, cricket playing fields. Mind you, in 126 years of first grade cricket, they'd never produced one Australian player. But and I suspect there's another reason why Australia's so bad at rugby. Most of them kids come from private schools, but that's just my personal bias. They don't represent the real Australia. The Gonski campaign has been particularly important. For 12 months we put an additional 20 organisers on, and we work full time, and we essentially made funding of schools the second most important issue after health in the federal election. We always used to say we did that, but we never told the truth. But now I am telling the truth. Polling has showed that education and schools funding was the second most important issue, and we hurt the coalition seriously. That is just one of tens of thousands of snaps that were taken right across the country of teachers, principals and parents campaigning for Gonski, and it was a particularly important campaign. We have changed the narrative in my country from competition and choice drives improvements to one which says now, no, needs-based funding and targeting resources where it's needed drives improvement. And that has taken us nearly 3.5 decades to get that narrative changed. So you can see some of the figures there of the change that we made. 61% of voters supported Gonski. 63% prefer investment in schools to cuts to company tax. And they're very much aware of what's happening to Turnbull's plans. And the union campaigning on the ground, we had to work in our schools. It wasn't good enough just putting ads on television. It's a slow, hard, daily grind. Day in, day out, we kept saying to our people, you don't get up at a morning tea in your school, you don't get up at a staff meeting, you don't walk in without thinking, how am I going to give the message about schools funding today? Whether it be in the form of something in people's pigeonholes, whether it be an announcement over a coffee break, but we've got to get people talking about it in our schools. When you look at Australia though, when the government says they can't afford it, 38% of Australia's 1,500 largest company paid no tax, 2013-14. Volkswagen, Apple. We actually gave money to Rupert Murdoch's News Limited. We gave them tax subsidies. We're losing about $6 billion each year from global tax avoidance. If you look at New Zealand's figures, you'd probably find similar. Australia's richest 10 people worth $46 billion. That's 10 human beings. There's about 350 people here today. I'm just talking 10 of you. One table, possibly. It's worth $46 billion. That table over there, I can see. Yeah. Yeah. It's very nice of you to stay, given how wealthy you are. I really do. I do appreciate it. That's worth 3 times of 6 years of Gonski funding. Just the wealth of 10 people could fund Gonski 3 times over. So let's just look at what kind of nation we're setting up under these kind of massive concentrations of wealth that's happening in our countries under globalisations. We're concentrating wealth in the hands of a tiny few through privatisation and agendas and tax cuts. They elect governments that do their bidding, and yet we can have a situation where 3.5 million school children in Australia can be told the government can't afford to fund their schools on a needs basis. To me, again, that's a moral question. You've heard the money doesn't matter. You've heard of the money doesn't matter in schools? Of course you have. Well, I did a Google search on this, and it's extraordinary. It won't surprise you that across the world, the same phrases are being used by politicians, regardless whether they're in Florida or New South Wales or England or Canada. The second one I love the best, Socrates trained Plato on a rock, and then Plato trained Aristotle, roughly speaking, on a rock, so huge funding is not necessary to achieve the greatest minds and the greatest intellects in history, said an American governor. No systemic relationship between school expenditures and performance. Spending on schools not systematically related to student outcomes. Failed to show a consistent relationship. We've spent more money. Look at the results. It's not great. It goes on and on and on. There's thousands of these political statements, and they're all being repeated, and there's a source for them. One of the sources, of course, is Eric Handshake, an economist with Stanford University, who back in the 70s developed the notion that you had to test where every tax dollar went in schools, and if you couldn't work out that what its measurable gain was, then you don't fund it. He's opposed to smaller class sizes and improvements and resources. He's a right-wing think tank darling, and he's trotted out across the... Most of that kind of money doesn't matter narrative comes from the right-wing think tanks in the US and the UK that we've got in our country, and I no doubt in your country too. These are deliberate narratives. They're not natural. They have been developed and they are shared, and we've got to be aware of the source and what they're doing. Can I just finish with a couple of slides on what's happening to vocational education and training? Australia had, we believed, one of the strongest vet vocational education training systems in the world under our TAFE system, a public system. They've now growing, they've now privatising it through a contestable funding model where TAFE, the public system, has to compete for funds against private for-profit providers. And you'll see there the incredible escalation in the amount of allocated contestable funding. It's now about 46% of all vet funding in Australia is contestable and going to for-profit commercial companies. You can see how much money they're getting, the increase in money to private providers. So we're taking money off the public system and giving it to for-profit providers. It's been driven by a loan scheme called Vet Fee Help. It doesn't help anyone except the big companies who are making billions out of it. We estimate that the Australian TAFE students, vet students, are in debt to the tune of about $4.6 billion. These are kids and their families who have not even got a job yet. $4.6 billion debt. 80% of that debt, 80% of that $4.6 billion of student debt goes directly to shareholders in private companies. They will hold the debt for life, they'll take the debt to their grave, and a huge majority of those kids don't even have a qualification because so many of the companies have gone belly up and broke. There are just some of the companies, some of them are under investigation, and the amount of money they've got from government student loans. So Careers Australia, $229 million. 80% of that to their shareholders. And you see the others. It's a national disgrace. I just want to finish on this couple of points. Beware of the word reform. We're almost being reformed out of existence. Reform is just a code word now for privatisation and a neoliberal agenda. And we've got to have the antenna to work out what is real reform, what real changes, which should be teacher-driven, and what is imposed. The OECD looked at 450 education reforms between 2008 and 2014 across 34 nations. Only 1 in 10 has ever been evaluated by governments. And yet we hear governments all the time talk about evidence-based decision-making. Rubbish. It's policy-driven decision-making that we believe favours the advantage. Can I finish with this point? You talk about our actions as part of your theme for this conference. And this quote, I think, to me, sums up the notion of what action is. It's advisable that the teaching profession should understand and even be able to criticise the general principles of which the whole education system is formed and administered. A teacher is not like a private soldier in an army, expected to merely obey, or like a cog in a wheel, expected merely to respond. The teacher must be an intelligent medium of action. And our action, our values, and yet that was John Dewey in 1895, and it's as true today as it was back then. If we don't take control of the agenda, on behalf of our students, there are other people who will. And it will not be in the interests of you as professional education workers. It will not be the interests of your teachers. So the kind of work you're doing is critically important. I've said this to beginning teachers. There's no more important profession doing the work that teachers do, because we don't just educate an individual child, we transform a nation. And that's a huge responsibility. Thanks very much.